Govan.
Melody. Professor Whitty, before the short adjournment, we had touched on the issue of testing and the ask that had been made of the Department for Education in December, and its understanding that if the ask was met, there was a prospect that schools would open. I think towards the end of that section of your evidence, you said that testing wasn't a panacea. Can I just ask you a bit about that, please, just to understand why testing wouldn't have met the challenges that the new strain of the virus then presented in respect of schools? Because on the face of it, the idea that you could have a mass testing event at the start of term and then regularly test children might be thought to have been quite a good way of keeping the virus out of schools. Can you explain a bit more about why that wasn't the position?
Yes, so thank you. So at its simplest, and I can go into more detail if it's useful, testing will reduce the amount of transmission that occurs between people if it's well done and if people sort of buy into it, and importantly, if they test positive, they isolate. That is a key issue. And the Department for Education, and I'd like to pay great tribute in both the department but also to teachers, because teachers did a terrific job all the way through, as did all other school staff, all the way through the pandemic under very difficult circumstances. So I can see why they would have found this very difficult to understand at the time. But the difference you make is partial. So you reduce the amount of transmission between people, but you don't take it to zero. Clearly, if people don't meet up at all, you take it down to zero. And so the difference between a school closure, which essentially leads to no transmission in the school, and a reduction in the indirect transitions we've talked about, will have a much bigger impact on the R than the testing will. Testing is at its most useful in stopping outbreaks within a school. So when you've got very low transmission, an outbreak starts, you get on top of it by testing. It also allows individual pupils to, rather than isolate, do serial testing so that they can carry on going to school as long as their test is negative. So those are two very positive things. What they have much less effect on is the ability to actually have a substantial reduction in the R component, which is what schools contribute, unfortunately, to the total R, the total transmission, force of transmission for the country as a whole. So the testing wasn't able to make the difference between the schools being open, schools being closed, and in particular, it wasn't able to make the difference when the transmission rates were high. So all the evidence shows that testing systems are at their most useful, testing and isolation systems, when the numbers are small and you can essentially find small clusters of transmission and jump on them very quickly before they start to spread. When transmission is as widespread as it was by the time we got to the beginning of January 2021, that rate of transmission was so high that the chances of testing being able to get on top of it were also very low. That, in a sense, that's a separate point to the previous point I made, but it's a linked point.
All right. Maybe we can see that reflected in some of the advice that you gave at this stage. And perhaps we could start by looking, please, at INQ 000072272. So I think we can see this is an email from you of the 28th of December, and you're commenting on a document. I don't think we need to look at the document because we're going to come to another document that you commented on. But I think that we can see, if we look at paragraph 1, and the inquiry's already heard evidence about what the Department for Education was trying to provide and working towards providing at this point. And you've set out, I think, the pros and especially the cons of the current DFE case are not fully laid out in a way that ministers can make an informed choice. It's obviously a bit of a shot in the dark with limited but worrying data. The current DFE proposal in response to this substantial new threat is absolutely minimalist. Delay by 1 week, some secondary school pupils returning, that's it, everything else steady as she goes, which if we get control is fine and will look sensible. But if in 4 weeks we find we've lost control, in the sense that cases are rising significantly, despite Tier 4 plus school opening. And we may well find that, and modelling suggests we will, and the NHS is under significant pressure and deaths are rising fast. We have to pull the emergency brake. Can I just break that down a bit to try and understand what you're advising? Sorry, I'm being asked to keep my voice up. I will endeavour to. So can I just break down, please, what that advice was essentially setting out? So I think it was being suggested that what was being suggested by the Department for Education to meet the threat was minimalist, although from the evidence provided by the Department for Education, it was meeting what had been asked of it by the Department of Health. And I suppose the question is there more that could have been done at this stage in order to meet the threat, or really had the point been reached where there wasn't any more that could be provided?
In a sense, my view is that both the Department of Education position and what's said here are both true and compatible. So what the Department of Education essentially was working to was a Wuhan variant playbook based on the fact that we had managed to get some level of control on Wuhan in what was then called Tier 4, with schools being closed for the holiday period. And the view was probably, with a bit of luck, with the Wuhan variant, if they'd done some relatively modest interventions plus the testing, that might have been enough to have allowed schools to open. The point I'm making here, though, and this is explicitly about the new threat, is it's not going to be capable of meeting this new threat, which is substantially more transmissible. And this, I think, is where the gap of understanding probably opened up between some people, only quite a minority in my view, but some people in the Department of Education and people who are looking at the data, was that this was not just a small modification of threat. This threat was substantially greater and was going to require a substantially greater set of plans than the ones which had been aimed for before this point in time. Now, this, of course, was also complicated by the fact we were in the middle of the Christmas-New Year period, so data were not coming in as fast or as reliably as you'd expect, and there were a lot of uncertainties about what the data meant, because social mixing over that period is very different to what it is in the rest of the year. But that's the fundamental, is that it was not really meeting the size of the new threat, rather than that it hadn't been properly executed for the old one.
And I think the question that I'm asking, recognising that, is whether or not there was more that could have been offered or planned at this stage, short of school closures again to most children.
The implication of what I'm saying, reading between the civil service lines, is if the Department of Education had suggested, for example, there's just these two groups that absolutely need to go into school because they've got exams coming, whatever it is, we might have been in a position where we could look at that. But the kind of what essentially was being offered was something that was so small, there was zero chance that, in my view, that were this to start to run, which I thought it was likely to run, and indeed it did run, that it would actually meet the need. So that was the problem, was the Department of Education wasn't, and I'm sure we were all at fault on this, but it wasn't in any sense, in my view, providing a solution that, with some modifications that they could have defined, would have met the need given the emergency we were about to face. And I think it is important to say at this point, people forget that more people were in hospital by a long way and more people died by a long way in the wave that followed this than the first wave that people tend to put a lot of their emphasis on. This was a huge impact, and it turned into a massive issue, which I think sometimes when you read these, you kind of think, well, this is a bit of a bump on the road. This was the biggest wave we had in terms of mortality and in terms of pressure on the NHS.
Just reading what you've said here. So first of all, you posit, and this is 4 lines down, which if we get control. So did you think at this point there was a possibility that control might be obtained over the virus at this point?
I thought it was possible. But I think that the general view of SAGE at this point was it was fairly unlikely. And then, as new data came in the next few days, as I say, probably not helped by irregular data over the Christmas period, I think it became clear we were not going to get control with the measures we had in place.
Okay, and then the other thing that you say, it's a few lines down. And it's the point, if deaths are rising fast, we'll have to pull the emergency brake. And you say at short notice this is likely to mean the close of all education, primary, secondary, uni, further education, as that's the only thing we'll have left with a significant impact. This would obviously be disruptive to all education. That is effectively what happened, though, within a very short period of time. Although it was the school holidays and therefore not quite the emergency break, nonetheless, some primary schools did go back on the 4th of January. I mean, was there, and we'll come on to the advice that was given the next day, but was there any scope for letting this play out a bit longer to see what the direction of travel was before pulling the emergency brake, as seems to be posited here?
In reality here, I thought that we probably had a few more days than we actually in the end did. And running forward, hoping this is helpful to you, running forward to the point where the CMOs said, based on JCB advice, this looks as if in all 4 nations, there is a high chance that the NHS will be overrun within 21 days. That was the test for a Tier 5. At that point, essentially, all you have is emergency brakes, because the speed at which it was moving, you couldn't then wait, given the doubling times that were happening, and given that, compared to where we were when we closed, we collectively, the country, closed education with the Wuhan variant, actually the number of cases and number of deaths was relatively small at the point we did that. At the point we did it with the Alpha variant, the numbers were incredibly high already, and 3 or 4 doubling times from that was an extraordinarily dangerous place for us to get to. So waiting for another couple of doubling times to see what happened would have been, in my view, potentially catastrophic. And that really was at the foundations of the decisions that were made at this point in time.
So if we just look then at the advice I think that was provided the next day, and this is INQ 0000-72273. And this is some draft advice. And I think, Professor Whitty, your comments are in the boxes alongside it. Is that right?
Probably.
Let's see if you recognise them.
Yeah.
But if we go over the page, please, to page 2, that might be a helpful starting point, just so that we can make sure we have this correct. At paragraph 7, we can see there's a placeholder in light of the worsening situation, alert level 5 update. And then I think here is the test is, do we think the NHS is likely to be overwhelmed in the next 3 weeks? And it sets out here, although some areas and hospitals are under significant pressure nationally, the judgment of the NHS medical director, with which I agree, is that they will not. Overwhelmed is a high bar for an emergency service.
Yes,
is
and
sorry. I just wanted to make sure that
is my comments,
yes.
And in a sense, what changed between this and the point we actually said that it needs to be level 5 was that our judgment was actually now we were going to. But I think what this makes clear is that I was reluctant to do this. This was not something that I or the medical director of the NHS or indeed any of the CMOs wished to go down this path. We went down it because we had to, rather than, as you can see from this, because we had any desire to.
So if we look then, if we go to page 4, please. And I think this is, in terms of the advice that's being provided to the Prime Minister, option A, escalate through the tiers, proceed with the Department for Education's recommended school plan. So those are the plans that we've heard evidence about in respect of testing and holding back the return to school, I think by this stage, for secondary schools to the 18th of January. And I think we can see, if we look at paragraph 16, that's set out.
Yep.
And in fact, it's made clear in the last line, schools would roll out their testing programme within the week commencing the 11th of January, and exam cohorts would return to face-to-face teaching with a full return of other groups by the 18th. So obviously by this stage, schools had been off on their Christmas holidays. Quite a long period had elapsed in terms of taking things to the 18th of January. I think we see then in your comment beside that, let's be frank here, the suggestion of the Department for Education means that in response to this substantial new threat, where opening school increases the threat, there is no change to early years, primary, vulnerable students, children of key workers, and a maximum of 1 week change to remaining secondary pupils. I'm not saying this is wrong, that's a political decision, but it's about as de minimis a change as it would be possible to concede and still be credible. The way this para is written implies this is a significant shift, which it's not, it's minimal.
Yes, and my point, I mean, leaving aside that by civil service terms, that's quite a strong statement. What I'm really saying is that this is not laid out in a way which, in my view, was clear and would make ministers understand the choice they were making. And my worry was that this was a paper that was going to be put to the Prime Minister and to Cabinet Ministers that implied, if you read it quickly, you'd think, oh, they're great, they're doing lots of things. And actually what they were intending to do was very much the plan that we had before the alpha wave began. And my concern was that ministers had to see in very stark terms what was it that they were agreeing to do. And my view was the way this was laid out, it was laid out in a way that made it very difficult for them, I think, to realise how little they were in fact doing compared to the previous plan.
All right, and if we look, I think, again at paragraph 18, which set out the approach relies on robust delivery of testing with maximal take-up by schools, on which we have significant concerns. Even with the extra week's delay, in the return of secondary schools, it's an ambitious timetable. Department for Education has been commissioned for further advice, but key delivery challenges will include the competency and willingness of schools in setting up testing arrangements. We've heard evidence from Miss Ackland Hood that in fact the Department for Education was quite confident that schools would apply the testing regime, but in your view, would that have made any difference by that point? So in other words, even if there had been confidence in the plan and schools were ready and willing to implement it, would it have made a difference?
I mean, I absolutely could see the determination of schools to wish to open if they could, and for the Department of Education to make that possible. And so I didn't see any reason to doubt that they would achieve a good outcome in terms of mechanistically what they'd said they would do. The problem was that this was no longer sufficient for the extraordinary change in the risk that we now faced, based on starting with a very high level already and accelerating up at a very considerable rate at this point. And that's the point I'm trying to capture here, and what I suggested would happen is what happened.
Yes, and I think in the box there you're repeating the point again that you thought the worst outcome would be to let this play out and then have to pull the emergency chain.
I think this is actually, I think almost certainly this is something that was attached to the email I sent, because the two look as if they're referring to one another.
So it's the same point again.
It's the same point, just put in a different way.
But in any event, that point was reached by the 4th of January, yes, and the emergency chain was pulled.
Unfortunately, yes.
And can I just ask you about that? Because Sir Gavin Williamson has given evidence before the inquiry about that decision. And I think there are a couple of points that he made that I think I need to put to you to ask for your epidemiological perspective on them. I suppose most important of all, he said that it was a decision, and I'm talking here about the decision to close schools to most children again. He said that he thought that it was wholly unnecessary. And he said that there had been exceptionally high rates of COVID-19 in northern towns and cities, yet it had been possible to keep schools in these areas open over this period. And that whilst it would be exceptionally challenging at a national level, he thought it was the right thing to do, as keeping children in school was so beneficial to them. So can I ask you about, from an epidemiological perspective, his opinion that closing schools was wholly unnecessary?
I mean, I think there are sort of two ways of answering that, and I obviously can't see into his mind and the way he's thinking, nor would I think that would be helpful to the inquiry. But what we had at the moment, objectively, was a very large number of people already in hospital and the numbers going up every day. So we were starting at a very high base in the middle of winter. Second point. Third point, where the R was now significantly above 1, not because anyone wasn't doing what they were supposed to, because by and large people were exceptionally good at trying to follow the recommendations that came from government, both professionally and personally. So it was absolutely not that. But it's just we had a really substantially, not slightly, but substantially more transmissible virus that had an R now that was potentially quite a bit above 1, and where we thought we could pull it down with non-school measures quite a lot of the way towards 1, but we were not at all confident to the point of thinking it's unlikely that we could put it all the way below 1 without closing schools. And so the choice, therefore, in front of the Prime Minister and ministers, from an epidemiological point of view, is: are you content in the middle of winter with this very high number for the R in all probability to be above 1, i.e. for this virus to carry on doubling for the foreseeable future? That was the epidemiological reality. And it was to that reality, given the very large numbers of deaths, that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet as a whole was responding. So I think, and you know, this is not a theoretical point, as I say, because as it showed, unfortunately, over the next 3 months, more people died in this wave, more people went into hospital in this wave than did in the first wave. But there was a final point, and I think that this is one that also I think sometimes gets lost, and I wasn't convinced that Sir Gavin picked it up in his evidence, so I'm going to make it now, which is: we now knew we had the vaccine and we were rolling it out. And we were confident that unless this new variant was very resistant to the vaccine, and we saw no particular reason why it should be, because it wasn't under any selection pressure, so I don't do it in ecological selection pressure. So there's no reason why it should be. We were confident that the mortality and severe disease from this disease would be falling away very rapidly by the time we got to about March, which would also be about the point when the NHS tends to be under less pressure, and then it would improve basically day on day from now on in. But we hadn't yet got to the point where all the most vulnerable people were vaccinated. You then had to wait 2 weeks for the effect to actually happen. So if we could just get through this next few weeks, then even if the rates remained high, the mortality rates, as indeed turned out, would fall right away. And from then on in, even if COVID continued to circulate, the risk of mortality would be very, very substantially reduced. Now, that was very different to the first wave. In the first wave, you can make the case that, OK, people won't get it this time and die this time, but there'll be another wave and they'll catch it that time. So in a sense, it's just delaying. Whereas in this wave, if you could just delay for three months, then you could be in a situation where actually most of those people had almost no chance of dying at all and a very reduced chance of severe disease. Now, that was really, therefore, what the Prime Minister was faced with, was a very high risk and an exit strategy, which is an incredibly durable exit strategy based on vaccination. And the question was he prepared to let it to run and carry on going up? Because you can argue about exactly the numbers, but it is absolutely certain that the numbers would have been higher had the school closure not happened. And so then I think the political choice, the societal choice, the philosophical choice is, where do you put the emphasis between that substantially increased overall mortality and the substantial lifelong lasting effects of education not occurring for children and all the effects on mental health which have been laid out by other people? That's a perfectly legitimate choice, but to imply that there wasn't actually a very heavy cost to not acting, I think, is to misunderstand the problem from an epidemiological point of view.
I think one of the things he suggested was that school closures needed to be made, and I'm summarising his evidence, that this decision needed to be made in order to demonstrate to people how serious the situation was. In other words, it was to have an impact to make people stop doing whatever it was they were doing in order to reduce transmission. Is that accurate? Was there any part of it that was...
I never thought... So insofar as one reading, and this may not be what he meant, but I'm going to take it as one possibility. One reading of what Sir Gavin said was that the only reason for doing this was just for theatrical reasons, to prove to people this is a big problem. I don't think people needed any proof on that. They could see the numbers going to the NHS. It was day-to-day numbers were going up. So I think people were fully aware of that, nor was there any evidence that I could see that people were not doing their best to adhere to the regulations and the advice that was given. So certainly from my point of view, that would have been an unnecessary thing to do. And I didn't see anybody who was arguing that in any of the meetings I was in, that the only reason we were doing this was to make a point. I think people were absolutely seized with the view that stopping education for a further time was extremely damaging. I think that was universally agreed. So that, in a sense, to that extent, Sir Gavin's position and that of everyone else was 100% the same. And I think what most people were doing was saying we got a very difficult choice between two very difficult things. And that was obviously an extremely hard choice for the government to make. And you can argue whether it's the right one, but it was certainly made on the basis that this is likely to save lives that would not otherwise have been lost, because the vaccine will very soon be in a position where it'll essentially reduce very substantially the risk we face from here on in.
It may follow from everything you've said, Professor Whitty, but was the decision to close schools in January 2021 a more finely balanced one than the decision that had to be made in March 2020?
I think from an epidemiological point of view, I don't think it was finely balanced. I think it was, if the only thing you were trying to do was trying to prevent deaths, I think that the case in January was every bit as strong as it was in the initial closure in March 2020, and arguably because of this fact that the vaccine was just around the corner, in fact a stronger one from an epidemiological point of view. However, counter that, you already have children who have lost a lot of education. We have extremely clear evidence, not surprising evidence, but nevertheless very substantial evidence of not just educational harm, but mental health harm, many other harms as well from people being in school now. Difficult sometimes to tease those apart from being in lockdown and all the other strange things that were happening to childhood over this period, so I don't want to claim it's all schools. Nevertheless, that certainly was part of it. So the choices between those two terrible harms, and to that extent it is in a sense politically and societally balanced, but it was not. The epidemiological case was an extremely strong one in January, unfortunately.
And can I just ask you then, coming away from that second set of school closures, was there any clearer scientific consensus as to whether it was the closure of schools per se that reduced the R number in that period as opposed to the indirect effects? In other words, are we any clearer today as to whether it's schools or the behaviours around schools that reduce R?
Well, leaving aside the question about whether many of the behaviours, as you did around schools, are just intrinsic to schools. So you can't, I think it's a fantasy to believe that you can have schools open and yet no parents meeting at gates and so on. And those kind of things just will happen. That's just a practical reality. But leaving that aside, the evidence wasn't massively clearer at this stage. What did appear to be happening, and I think it's, in retrospect, I think it's a bit less clear than it appeared at the time, actually, but certainly at the time that the decision was being taken by political leaders, it looked as if there was a much higher proportion of the transmission was among children than previously. And that, if you look at the epidemiological curves that were done in terms of testing people per age, what you can see is really the highest peaks very often were in children of school age. In terms of the numbers of people affected, not obviously the number, fortunately, in hospital or dying, but in terms of actually infected. So there was certainly a lot of transmission among children, what we were still not clear about was what proportion of the overall R was driven by that fact. But in fact, there was probably better evidence of transmission among children in this wave than there was in the previous one.
The other thing that seems to be different about this wave was that there were regional differences as well. So this wave was more focused in the south of England than the north. In your view, would it have been realistic to have taken stricter measures in parts of the country and to allow other parts of the country and schools, I mean specifically in other parts of the country, to remain open?
I think that, I think in the document you showed last, the second point I made was, should we be putting to ministers, do you want to do this? I made that as an active suggestion to the Cabinet Office that this is something which ministers maybe should consider. My worry was that, because it wasn't being taken off the table because of epidemiological evidence, it was because there was an assumption that schooling decisions were taken at a national level. And I just thought, well, is that sensible? Actually, as it turned out, the time between the wave maximising in the south of England and the north wasn't huge, so probably we wouldn't have gained an enormous amount about it. But I thought the possibility was there that you could differentiate between, for example, the north and the south. You couldn't do it at a kind of really micro level, but you might have been able to at a slightly higher level.
Professor Whitty, I want to turn, if I may, then to some future planning and future issues. I think from evidence that you've given before, you are of the view that ventilation is potentially a more important issue than perhaps was previously realised. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And may I ask you about your views then on the use of ventilation in schools as a way of potentially dealing with future pandemics and generally in terms of ventilation being a good thing for children's health and well-being?
Yes, so I think it's an uncontroversial statement from an epidemiological point of view to say that improving ventilation in schools would be a good thing. It would not just for future pandemics. Hopefully we won't have to face one of them for a long time of a respiratory sort like this one. But also for just year-on-year flu and other respiratory infections, which cause a lot of trouble in schools, lead to individuals not having their schooling, lead to outbreaks locally, and it also actually has implications for indoor air pollution, which is something which I've written on in a completely different context. So the advantages of ventilation are very substantial, and I think the school estate is very variable in terms of how much ventilation there is, and also how much ventilation there is in a way that can also keep the school warm enough that children can be able to work and to study in winter. Now that's something very much to put to Professor Noakes, who's you're I think talking to in 2 days' time about the extent to which that is a realistic proposition. But if it's realistic, and I think our evidence implies it is realistic from the written statement, then it is clearly highly desirable.
Grateful, Professor Whitty. The other thing is that obviously during the period of the pandemic, there were infection control measures brought into schools to encourage children to wash their hands. Also, simple measures like the wiping down of surfaces. Do you, and I suppose I'm asking you this question in the context of your role as CMO to England, do you think that there is good reason to continue those sorts of measures in schools, and is enough being done to encourage the continued use of infection control measures in schools?
I mean, on the second, I think you'd have to ask an educationalist, but on the first, very clearly there are advantages, both immediate advantages in terms of reducing infections and therefore the consequence of infections, which sometimes can be serious but often can at least be interfering with education, and arguably maybe even putting in getting people used to lifelong habits which will reduce the risk to themselves and their families of completely preventable infectious diseases that otherwise would be transmitted via touch or respiratory routes. So I certainly think there are strong arguments for that.
And I think there are just two residual matters, which I think I have time for in the couple of minutes left. The first thing is just going back to SAGE and about who observes SAGE meetings. Do you think that there is any scope, for example, for having individuals who have statutory obligations towards children, like the Children's Commissioner for England, to be able to have them as observers to SAGE so that they understand the potential ramifications of the issues that are being discussed and have the ability to raise that with government? Or would that not be an appropriate attendee for SAGE?
So, as my lady will have seen, the list of people who felt they should have been on SAGE and who were not would have filled this room very easily. So you have to be quite careful that you don't end up in a situation where you have a very large number of people who either say nothing or are saying things that aren't going to probably contribute to the scientific discussion. And that is the key. SAGE is a scientific body. SAGE had on it paediatricians and people whose background was in child health. As it happens, in fact, my early research career was in infectious diseases in children, for example. So it wasn't that there was no experience of children and their health problems. Is it reasonable for people to be observers in certain situations? Yes. But I think what we should do is keep SAGE as a scientific body and have the policy decisions into which the Children's Commissioner quite rightly wished to, in this case, insert herself, and the current Children's Commissioner inserts herself rightly, keep them in a sense separate. There's a sort of scientific stage and then there's a policy stage, and I think it's generally better, unless they're wishing to make a scientific point, it's generally better that their contributions on a day-to-day basis are made in that way. However, I did think that the challenge from the previous Children's Commissioner was an entirely fair and sensible one. So I think from time to time a Children's Commissioner saying, have you thought this? And I've read the minutes and I think you've missed that. That's a very sensible thing to do. That doesn't require them to sit around the table and make comments, because unfortunately there are many other people you could rightly apply that to.
And then the second thing is, I think that, and again I'm summarising evidence that you've previously given before, that you thought that there could have been an earlier emphasis on wearing masks in relation to children. Is that correct?
I thought there could be an earlier emphasis on wearing masks in the adult population, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things. If we were to rerun the scientific advice, we'd have got to that place at a much earlier stage. For children, I think it's a more balanced question. For the youngest children, I think everybody agrees that they're inappropriate and potentially harmful just at a physical level and almost certainly interfere with their development. But I think that there was quite a lot of evidence alongside the benefits to masks from a transmission point of view that they also interfere with particularly the teaching process and the learning process, both of younger children and of older children. And it was for that reason that we didn't have masks in the classroom, except at the absolute peaks of some of the areas where the choices between having a mask in the classroom and probably not having the school open at all. So I don't think any of us really looked back and wished we'd pushed mask wearing more in children and specifically in educational settings. And I think we need to be a bit more differentiated. This is going back to the previous point, differentiated between the adult advice, where I think the advice was pretty clear-cut, albeit not as strong as sometimes implied, and the children's advice, which is quite a bit more of a balance of two risks.
And Professor Whitty, finally, you've set out some of your reflections in your witness statement. May I just ask on behalf of the inquiry whether there is anything further that you would add to those observations, specifically in relation to children, or if it's all set out in your statement?
It is set out probably in my statement, but if I could just highlight two, one really obvious one and one slightly less obvious to most people, although you've read my statement. The obvious one is, I think, planning for children and specifically for education should be part of any pandemic, and the hope is you'll never need to use it. But I think not to plan for it is not a good idea, given the extraordinary importance that education has for children. So I think, in a sense, I think everybody who's a witness here would agree with that. But I'm adding my weight to that position. The wider one, I think, is we need to be a bit careful. As I've read some strong but well argued, there are also strong and less well argued things saying we should never ever close schools again. I think that we should be very careful of those kind of statements. Every pandemic is different. Had this been a pandemic like influenza, particularly the influenza pandemic of 1918-19, where a very large proportion of the deaths and serious illness were in children, higher than most adults, I think we would very clearly be reaching for schools not only to reduce the overall transmission, but also to protect the individual children. So, and at the other side, the last very serious pandemic, we had the HIV pandemic, school closure would have had absolutely no effect at all. It was a disease of young adults transmitted sexually. So I'm just saying we need to be a bit careful that we don't extrapolate from one pandemic to very different ones, and the routes of transmission also have an implication for that. But I've laid that out in a rather more formal way in the statement.
You have. My lady, those are all of my questions. I think there are some core participant ones. I think some I have asked, but I think there are some residual ones.
I think so, and I think that very helpfully that they've been abandoned, given you have covered them. Miss Hannett, who's just there.
Thank you, my lady. Professor Whitty, I appear on behalf of Long COVID Kids and Long COVID Kids Scotland. On the 31st of May 2021, you advised the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, that long COVID is clearly a large enough problem to be concerned about in what was entitled a short note on long COVID. You gave evidence this morning that you well understood long COVID in children 9 months after the consensus statement of August 2020 and would have provided information on long COVID to parents had you known about it in August 2020. Why then, some 9 months later in May 2021, at the same time as you were providing that advice to Mr Johnson, was there not a further public statement issued on the risk of paediatric long COVID, particularly given that it hadn't been identified in August 2020?
Well, let me break that down into two parts. I mean, the first of which is, I think you imply a greater degree of certainty than my note says. In fact, I start off my note saying the reason this is a personal note rather than a SAGE note is there is no consensus. So this was me giving my view, and I was really explicit about that at several points. This is a personal view. And the reason it was a personal view was that the evidence was weaker and more mixed, but nevertheless, I gave the view that I had at the time. There were very large numbers of things in COVID which, as we went along, we understood better. We didn't just issue statements every time that happened. They got into the public domain in any case. Long COVID in children was discussed in the media, was discussed in other fora. So I didn't think that there was a situation where nobody knew about it and only I knew about it and I needed to tell people. That would be completely incorrect. And also, I was quite cautious about going out with strong statements until we had a consensus, or at least a pretty good central view from the scientific community. And as I started my comments by saying, I didn't think that was the case at this point in time.
Just to follow up on that, if I may, Dr. Arora from UKHSA gave evidence last week to the inquiry that as much information that is known about a disease like long COVID should be shared with the public, even if that is to say where the limitations in the knowledge exist. Given that there hadn't been any public statement at all by the summer of 2021 on the risk of long COVID, so parents were effectively unaware of the possibility of long COVID, do you not accept that it would have been sensible at that point to explain about that, even if not all the information was available to you at that stage?
Well, I think, in a way, I'm only repeating myself, but I think there are two components to why I'd be cautious about this. Firstly, I was very cautious about going into the public unless I could tell people something which is going to help them to do something different. It wasn't obvious to me what that would be. And secondly, I was very cautious about going out unless I was confident I was in a situation where I was in the middle of a pretty strong evidence base. And as my note to the Prime Minister made clear, at that point, my view was I was not in that state which is why I had to give a personal view rather than say, here is a SAGE consensus view or here's a SAGE central view with a high degree of confidence.
And just again, one further follow-up, if I may, my lady. There still, to this day, remains, there's been no public statement or no public health messaging on paediatric long COVID. Do you agree that there should be?
I think, well, first, I consider that if you asked most parents, does this exist, I think most parents would at least have been aware of the debate around it. So I think the idea that this is not a known thing, I'm not sure I would fully agree to. It was in quite a lot of publications, and it was also covered in various bits of the media at various points. So I don't think this is something which nobody knows about. And I am really cautious about making statements unless I can say, and therefore, this is something which we are advising. Here, this is much less clear what we would be advising. The group who I think did need to know about this, and I think important point, but I was not the right person to do this, was the medical profession and other healthcare workers, and they do need to understand where the current science is so that they can respond appropriately when children who have symptoms compatible with long COVID present. Many of these children may not actually have long COVID, may have something else which is equally important, but certainly this should be one of the things that healthcare workers are thinking about, along with the other things that could look like long COVID but may or may not be at any particular point in time.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Hannett. And now we have Mr Wagner, who's that way.
Good afternoon, Professor. I want to ask you, I should say first that I act for clinically vulnerable families. I want to ask you first about the DFE guidance in July 2020 on schools reopening. I appreciate it's not your guidance, but one of the things the guidance said was that because shielding had ended, was about to end, this was a good justification for almost all children returning to school in September 2020, so a month later, including clinically vulnerable children and children in clinically vulnerable families. And my question is this: at the time that shielding was paused, did you know that or anticipate that it would be used in this way to justify previously shielded children or children in shielding families being mandated to attend school just a month later?
Well, I'm going to sort of repeat an answer I gave earlier because I think that overlaps quite heavily with something which Counsel for the Inquiry asked me. But I think let's separate out two separate sets of things. The first set of things is the question, was the reason that we were advising children who'd been previously advised that they were clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable to go to school, was that because we were pausing shielding? And the answer is not really. The principal reason was because we no longer thought that they needed to have shielding based on much more up-to-date information. So in contrast to adults, where we considered that the risk was still there, but had gone a long way down because the amount of COVID was much lower in the summer. In the case of children, our view was the risk was not there for that reason, but more importantly, it was not there because there was no evidence they were at increased risk in the first place, or at least in any meaningful way compared to peers of the same age. The separate question, which I think I hopefully also addressed earlier, was the question about a child in a family where the adult is shielding. And here that is slightly more of a relevant consideration. In the period when the schools reopened, the level of COVID was extremely low. So the probability that the child, by going to school, would be introducing it to the vulnerable adult, and the vulnerable adult would therefore come to harm, was actually very low, just on purely statistical grounds. So to that extent, the shielding point was relevant there. But there was a wider point, which was, by this point, the harms of children not going into education were really clear. And there was a policy decision, which I think most people would consider is very reasonable, that we would prioritise the needs of the child for their lifelong learning, given the relatively small additional risk that this posed elsewhere.
Thank you. And clearly the risks went up and down through that period, and those different factors you've described will have gone up and down as well. And I just want to ask you, in that respect, about choice. And I think you said in your in module 3 that the end of shielding wasn't a cliff edge, because people who were clinically vulnerable chose perfectly reasonable to continue what they'd previously done. So some people chose to do one thing and some people chose to do others. Now, would you accept that when it came to school attendance in September 2020, but also going into the autumn as cases started to rise, that it was important that those families that had a clinically vulnerable member of the family or a clinically vulnerable child could continue to choose to do what they had previously done or to shield as the risk factors started to change?
So I think that in a sense, and this is just a development of what I've just said in the last answer, in the case of the children, we no longer thought that they were clinically vulnerable, and that was our clear advice to them, based on data put together by the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. So in contrast to the adults who were still clinically vulnerable, but we thought the risk was low because there was not much COVID, in the case of the children, our view was they weren't clinically vulnerable in the first place, based on objective evidence. So that's the first clear point. There are a small number of people to whom that was an exception, but that was a very small subset of the number of people who we initially thought might be at increased risk, fortunately. I think on the question about mandation of schooling for children in a context where actuarially the risk is very low because the transmission rates were low at this point, the question about whether schooling should be compulsory or not strikes me as absolutely a question of political choice and societal choice rather than a clinical question. So in a sense, I would defer it. But I would say that historically, governments around the world have always tended to have a strong view that children should have education for their long-term benefit. And I'm sure it's on that basis that these decisions are taken by political leaders.
I'm out of time. I've got one more question.
All right, Mr. Wagner.
Thank you very much. Just finally, and it's on a similar topic, who do you think should determine whether shielding or non-attendance at school for a clinically vulnerable child or a clinically vulnerable family is necessary? And I ask that in the context of the reports from CVF members, a lot of CVF members, that often when they, and particularly when the case rates were not low, that they were told during that autumn that and winter that their children had to attend or they'd be punitively dealt with.
Well, I think all of your questions are essentially the same question, so I will give a sort of same answer, which is the decision as to whether someone is or is not clinically vulnerable as an absolute, and the decision about whether this is a point in time which is a high-risk person for clinically vulnerable people are questions of, in a sense, epidemiological and clinical fact. So I think reasonably you would expect medical practitioners at an individual level and epidemiologists and public health people at a population level to be giving that advice to the public and therefore to individuals. The question as to whether the force of the law can be used in one situation or another is entirely one for essentially the proper authorities, and if the law is going to change for Parliament and political leaders, it's definitely not one for the medical profession. So our job is the first bit, to help define the group of people who are at risk and to make sure they understand that risk, and to make sure that the political leaders understand those risks when they make their decisions. The second choice is not for us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. I think that completes the questions we have for you, Professor Whitty. I mean, I do understand, I've said it several times before, so forgive my repetition. I know we've placed a huge burden on your office, on you personally, on your colleagues, and of course on the Department of Health. And so I'd just like to express my enormous gratitude to all of you for all the help that you've given. As ever today, you've been a really helpful witness, and I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you very much, my lady.
Very well. Hello again, Mr. Hewitt.
Affirm.
Hello again.
Nice to see you.
Sorry we've kept you waiting.
That's not a problem.
To read the card yourself.
I can read it. Yeah, I can read it.
When you're invited.
Okay.
My lady, please may I call Mr. Martin Hewitt? I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Before we start, my lady, the evidence you are about to hear will contain references to domestic violence and sexual offences involving children and young people. There may also be other content those listening might find upsetting. Mr. Hewitt, you have provided a corporate witness statement on behalf of the National Police Chiefs Council, the NPCC, to Module 8 of the inquiry dated the 14th of July 2025. And for the transcript, the reference we have for that is INQ 000651552. And Mr. Hewitt, can you confirm, please, that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can.
If we can start with your professional background, please, Mr. Hewitt. You joined Kent Police in 1993 as a police officer. You transferred to the Metropolitan Police in 2005. You progressed to the rank of Assistant Commissioner in the Metropolitan Police, and in 2015 you were appointed as the Vice Chair of the NPCC, which I understand at the time was a part-time role.
That's correct.
And you've split your time between the NPCC and your main job as Assistant Commissioner. And it was in 2019 you were appointed as the Chair of the NPCC, which now was a full-time role.
That's correct.
And therefore you served as the Chair throughout the entirety of the pandemic.
That's correct.
And if we can quickly turn to roles and responsibilities of the NPCC, you set out in your statement that the NPCC is a national coordinating body which represents all UK police forces, including territorial forces in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, some British overseas territories, the British Transport Police, the Civil Nuclear Constabulary and the Ministry of Defence Police. And you go on to say that the NPCC serves to drive best practice in policing and to act as one voice for policing into central government. Would that primarily be the Home Office?
Primarily, your route into central government is through the Home Office, that's correct.
And Mr. Hewitt, in terms of your interactions, would that be with the Home Secretary? Would it be ministers, civil servants?
Yeah, routinely with civil servants within the Home Office, and then through the Policing Minister, and then for various issues you would interact directly with the Home Secretary.
And finally, we know that in 2015, it was the NPCC that replaced the Association of Chief Police Officers, ACPO, is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Mr. Hewitt, in your evidence to Module 2 of this inquiry, you referred to bringing together chief constables to plan for how the police would ensure candidate security in the run-up to a general election. In ordinary times, is that a good example of how the NPCC would coordinate nationally?
I think it is an example of how, when you need a cross-policing response, because each individual police force is legally a separate entity, the NPCC can be utilised to bring different forces together to ensure that policing as a whole responds appropriately to whatever the situation was. And in that instance, as you say, there were concerns about candidate security in a December election. So it is a good example of what NPCC would be used for.
And on the point of legal independence, you explain in your witness statement that the NPCC has no operational directive powers in relation to forces in the UK. So is it right that the NPCC doesn't have any power to direct a police force on how to act?
That's correct.
And on the other hand, the NPCC can't tell an individual police force to refrain from acting in a certain situation?
No, we don't have authority in that sense.
And is that also the case in the context of a pandemic or a national emergency?
It is, yes.
And whilst operational policing decisions remain the responsibility of force leads, Are individual police forces expected to carry out their day-to-day business with reference to NPCC guidance, policy and briefings?
Yes, the role of NPCC is to provide some of that guidance, and working very closely with the College of Policing as well, in terms of providing both authorised professional practice and guidance. So there is an expectation, and every Chief Constable and every police force is a party to NPCC. But ultimately, the Chief Constable has the final say-so in terms of what they will actually deliver operationally in his or her force.
And Mr Hewitt, we know that from March 2020, as a direct result of the pandemic and lockdowns, that life changed for everyone and services had to adapt. We'll come on to this in more detail later this afternoon, but can you explain generally how day-to-day policing changed?
The start of the pandemic, fundamentally altered the challenge that policing faced. So throughout the pandemic, normal policing requirements existed, but it was then being undertaken in a unique set of circumstances. There was new legislation, new regulations that fundamentally altered the way society operated and the way, therefore, that the police were engaging with society. And that was certainly one of my key priorities when we were establishing the strategy at the beginning, was about that relationship, maintaining the relationship that we had with the public. It was very clear the regulations that were coming, because we'd been watching what had been happening from China and through Europe in terms of the very strong nature of what was happening, that was going to put policing into a very difficult position. And there was no experience in policing of actually day-to-day policing pandemic-type regulations that were being imposed on communities. So it was transformational in terms of what we had to deliver.
Mr Hewitt, you made reference to the policing the regulations. Is that, in fact, the COVID-19 regulations, which we will get onto as a separate topic? And is that also what you mean when you say in your statements that the police took on a public health policing role?
Yes, there was no public health policing role prior to that, but the primary objective here was saving lives and preventing harm. So that was a unique role for us to undertake.
And you've touched upon this already, Mr Hewitt, about normal policing in a unique circumstance. To what extent did the pandemic impact core policing functions that related specifically to children? So, for example, child protection and safeguarding units.
So we were still, as I said, we were still having to undertake all of our normal processes, but we were now undertaking them in an entirely unique set of circumstances, and from the very outset, once we realised what was coming, there was a real concern, particularly around domestic abuse in the general sense, and also child abuse. For any interfamilial child abuse and any domestic abuse, quite clearly, it was obvious that the pandemic and the COVID regulations were going to place people in very strict confinement within the premises where that sort of offending is taking place. So we were very clearly identifying that there were potential risks to people within the household and naturally, of course, children in those circumstances.
And Mr Hewitt, we'll come back to the NPCC's specific concerns relating to domestic abuse and child sexual offending. But please, can we turn now to the NPCC's specific pandemic-related response, which we know from your statement was named Operation Tala. Is that correct?
Yes.
I think it's important at this point to say that the purpose of Operation Tala was, again, not to hold operational command for policing, but to go back and provide national coordination.
Yes.
And you set out in your statement what that looked like, and you said, in terms of a pandemic-specific focus, that you were to make sure that there was clear communication between police forces. You were to provide guidance to frontline police officers. For example, you've already set out in relation to COVID-19 regulations, to capture and to share learning and to support individual police forces in contingency planning. Was there any specific work strand within Operation Tala or a dedicated lead within the NPCC that focused on children safeguarding or child protection during the pandemic?
Yeah, so we were operating. We brought Operation Tala together to ensure that we had consistency across the UK in terms of the way police forces were responding. But what we were utilising there was our existing structures within National Police Chiefs Council, and those structures are that we have a number. There are 12 coordinating committees that are each led by a chief constable, and in each one of those there are a number of other subcommittees and working groups that deal with very specific areas. So we had a children and young persons portfolio which was working within local policing. So the chief constable, or the deputy chief constable should I say, that was chairing that was really focused on all of the implications as far as children were concerned as we approached how we were going to deal with the pandemic. And then we also had a child protection and abuse investigation group as well that sat within our vulnerable violence and public protection group. So those areas were looking at the specific areas related to children, and they were then able to feed into our broader structures as we dealt with the pandemic in its various phases as it went through. But that allowed us to be identifying where we thought there were vulnerabilities and then responding, and most importantly sharing learning and practice as the various stages of the pandemic progressed.
Mr. Hughes, in terms of Operation Tala, we know that structures were in place in ordinary times, but when the pandemic hit, what role did the Home Office play in Operation Tala?
So the Home Office didn't really play a role in Tala. Clearly, that was the policing structures that I set up to ensure that we had a command and control structure in the way that we would respond in policing to any issue. Our direct link was across into the Home Office team that were working and managing the response within the Home Office. So we developed very close working relationships with them. And so I undertook the role as Gold Commander, which was the sort of overall setting the strategy. My Silver Commander, who was really, his role was to put my strategy into practice, worked very, very closely with the teams within the Home Office that were part of the crisis response infrastructure within the Home Office. So we worked closely in that way.
And we may come on to some examples of this, Mr. Hewitt, but during the pandemic, we know that information was fed from local forces into Operation Tala.
Yeah.
Would it be right, therefore, that Operation Tala would then maybe feed or raise concerns to the Home Office as to what you were seeing on the ground?
We would do that directly. That was precisely the purpose of the close working, and there were very regular Silver level conversations where we would go through, because the way Tala was arranged, I was running what I was running at a national level, but that operation was replicated in each one of the police forces where they themselves had their command and control structure. They would then feed into me at the centre, or my systems at the centre. We would then obviously link directly with the Home Office through the various groups that were established, and then through the other opportunities that I would have to feed directly at a ministerial level as we worked through the pandemic.
And just finally, Mr. Hewitt, before we move on to NPCC concerns, we know that policing is a fully devolved matter in both Scotland and Northern Ireland. Was there any difference between how the NPCC worked with police forces in England and Wales compared to police forces in Scotland and Northern Ireland?
No, so whilst NPCC is an organisation that is, the members of that are all of the forces that you spoke about at the beginning, which includes Police Service in Northern Ireland and Police Scotland, and they were fully part of the structure that we produced. But politically, obviously, Police Scotland were also facing inwards to the government in Scotland, and likewise to in Northern Ireland. And then the other complicating factor in Wales, whilst policing is devolved in Wales, the chief constables in Wales, the 4 chief constables in Wales, were very much part of Tala. We're obviously under the 43 forces that come under the Home Office in central government, but were also facing into the Welsh government as well. So it was quite complex for a number of the chief police officers to manage the political governance that they had in their particular area. But all of those chief constables and all of those forces were very much part of the Optala response and were integrated into all of the various processes that I ran to coordinate.
And so then in practice, Mr Hewitt, all NPCC guidance would be shared with all of the police forces that fell under the NPCC? It would. There were some amendments made in Scotland, some amendments in Northern Ireland, and in Wales the process was often slowed because we did translations as well, but all of that guidance was guidance that was shared across those forces. Mr Hewitt, I now want to move on to a new topic, and that is the NPCC concerns. We know that from the 17th of March 2020, the UK government started to introduce measures to slow the spread of COVID-19.
Yeah.
And that included social distancing and self-isolation. And if we can have on screen, please, INQ 0006-20975. We can see on screen, Mr Hewitt, that this is a briefing note from the NPCC Cross Vulnerabilities COVID-19 group. The document isn't dated, but it was produced around the time of the lockdown restrictions. And we can see at the bullet point on screen that the NPCC had a number of concerns around the potential for changes in the threat, harm and risk regarding the abuse and exploitation of our vulnerable individuals and groups as restrictions on daily life have been introduced to respond to COVID-19. In relation to children, was there a general concern that the risk of harm to them would increase significantly?
Yeah, the concern was really, I guess, the one that I've already kind of identified. A high, obviously, always a real concern about child abuse. So physical child abuse and even at that stage, the sort of online exploitation. So there was a real concern that the circumstances in which people were going to find themselves had the potential to increase the threat and risk in both of those circumstances. In the one that people were going to be confined more strictly than they would otherwise be confined, and in the second area, the fact that equally people were going to have much more time where they're potentially operating in a virtual space. So are those who have the sort of expertise, and Chief Constable Simon Bailey's reference there, who was the lead for child abuse issues at that time, we were really concerned around that. The other issue that was of a concern was the fact that there would potentially be, and we did see to some extent, a drop-off in reporting as well. Because, again, and this was similar with domestic abuse, when you are confined in the space where potentially that abuse is taking place, it's very difficult then to report. And also for children, oftentimes the place where either a key individual is able to spot signs of abuse, or where a child has the opportunity to disclose some abuse, loads of those opportunities were being closed down because the children were not going to school, they were not in environments where other professionals might be observing that. So we were concerned that all of those issues could lead to heightened levels of abuse and lower levels of reporting.
And Mr Hewitt, if we can now turn to the issue of domestic abuse, we know that domestic abuse in the home can affect children in a number of different ways. And there's reference in your evidence provided to the inquiry of increases in domestic abuse at Christmas and during the summer holidays. And the rationale for that relates to the increased amount of time which you've outlined of family members spending together. You also set out that alcohol is also a significant driver, and given that it's more likely to be consumed in the home rather than a public space, this is what also contributes to the rises. But because of the uncertainty at the start of the pandemic, and what I mean by that is how long the pandemic would last, because we know the Christmas period, when that's going to come to an end and when rates may fall. How concerned were the MPCC in relation to that, and was that fed back to the Home Office?
So we were very concerned. You've highlighted, or I highlighted, those particular areas where we know these things are, and whilst that largely focuses on domestic abuse, what's really important from my perspective is any domestic abuse that's happening in any premises is having a very negative impact on the children that are present within that premises, and you're starting to get the sort of adverse childhood experiences. So we were concerned, and all of our groups that focus in those areas. These were not things that were set up because there was a pandemic coming. These are the groups, as I say, within our structure that look at these issues and work very closely with other professionals, with support groups, with other interested groups within, whether it be within child abuse arena or be it within domestic abuse. So we were talking with all of those organisations because they would be getting a different perspective and they would be having access to different understanding, and it was about working together so that we could minimise the impact that we felt was inevitable when we were going to lockdown. And your point, identifying the difference between the pandemic and Christmas or the summer, is a really important point, because that was a really significant issue for policing. We can now look back and understand, but at the time we had no concept of when this pandemic was going to come to an end. It was not like most other critical incidents that I've dealt with, where you could reasonably expect within however long a period this will be into a recovery phase. We didn't understand that, so we were having to work really hard to try and understand what we needed to do with an indefinite endpoint.
Thank you, Mr. Hewitt. My lady, I think that takes us to the break.
Certainly. We shall finish today, I promise, Mr. Hewitt, but remember we take breaks for the stenographer. I shall return at 10:02.
All rise.
Mr. Lee.
Mr. Hewitt, you'll see on screen in a moment an article that was published by the Internet Watch Foundation on the 20th of March 2020. And we can see at the very top paragraph that experts are bracing themselves for a spike in public reports of child sexual abuse on the internet as more and more people stay at home during the coronavirus pandemic. And below, the Internet Watch Foundation explain why, and it relates to what you've already covered in your evidence about the impact that schools may have on children's increasing vulnerability, because they'll be spending more time online and at home. Did this therefore become a key priority area for the MPCC at the end of March?
Yes, I mean, as I've said, it was for our people that were working in this particular area. This was something that we were really very focused on straight away, in terms of understanding from individual forces what the level of reporting was, and being in a position to identify what we understood around that as well. So within the child abuse arena, there was a group, the Vulnerability Knowledge Practice Programme, which were a bunch of analysts that were brought together to in normal circumstances to allow us to understand what the instance was of particularly online abuse. And so we used those groups repeatedly through the process to be able to understand what we thought was happening, what we could see happening, and then working obviously with all the other organisations that we work with to try and manage that.
Would it be fair to say then, Mr. Hewitt, that at the end of March 2020, the increased risk to children of child sexual abuse, child online sexual offending was at the forefront of your mind, because you're anticipating that there would be a surge once we were in the full swing of lockdown?
It was very apparent to us that was a risk, and a heightened risk that existed because of the new circumstances.
If we can put on screen, please, INQ 000231060. Mr. Hewitt, we can see that this is a document which contains assumptions about whether crime during the COVID-19 pandemic would increase, decrease, or stay the same. And we can see in the section for sexual offences that it was anticipated there would be no change. But we can see in the highlighted section that given the child sexual abuse offences in general are underreported and contact child sexual offences tend to happen in a family environment, any increase in prevalence may not filter through to recorded crime. And we'll come back to that topic soon. But then it says police may also have less capacity to proactively target indecent images of children and online offending. Can you help us with what this document means when it says that the police have capacity concerns?
Well, apart from anything, I mean, it kind of comes back to the very original point in terms of what we were now being asked to do and were expected to do. There were all sorts of additional requirements that were being placed on policing because we were now policing in a health security environment. So that was having an impact on our resourcing and our capabilities. And one of the things that I had to look at the very beginning, we were projecting at the very beginning because, of course, the pandemic affected police officers and police staff as much as it affected any other member of the public. So we were really concerned at the outset about the staffing numbers that we may reduce to. As it transpired, that didn't become as much of an issue. But then it was also about how you can work with all the other organisations. Everybody was now in a locked down situation. So your ability to work collectively with other organisations was inevitably going to be limited.
Mr. Hewitt, finally on this topic, you've already briefly outlined the feedback you were provided to the Home Office about the NPCC concerns. Are you able to help us with whether that was fed back into the wider decisions to lock down and impose restrictions? And what I mean by that, not that in any way am I suggesting would have prevented lockdowns, but to set out what the consequences would be higher up government so mitigations could be considered and potentially imposed.
We had, as I say, through the workings that we had with the officials within the Home Office, there we were constantly feeding in anything as the pandemic progressed, where we felt there were particular implications that police were having to bear in relation to regulations and the rules that were being imposed. We were not directly consulted in any way prior to the initial lockdown, and that emerged, and we then had to work through how we were going to cope with that from a day-to-day policing perspective. I think it is fair to say that as the pandemic progressed and the relationships and the working relationships that we had developed, particularly with the Home Office, and then latterly our involvement with some of the work that was going on within the DHSC as well, we were able to give slightly more input. But certainly at the early stages, we had not had the opportunity to give any input into the way the regulations were formed. And obviously that created a significant number of consequences for the day-to-day delivery of policing on the ground.
Mr. Hewitt, we'll come back to your feedback in relation to the regulations. But just as the challenges for policing as a whole that you've already set out, when you were feeding that back to the Home Office, what was the response?
I think it would be fair to say that there was a real sympathy and understanding within the Home Office officials, and certainly good understanding, I think, on the part of the Police Minister at the time and the Home Secretary at the time. And I had very regular engagement with them where we would meet with other senior law enforcement officials on a very regular basis to ensure that everybody understood the implications of what was going on. I guess the challenge then was how that Home Office perspective, and therefore the element of the policing perspective, was then finding its place within the broader central government view as things were moving forward. Certainly, I think it would be fair to say that the Home Office understood our challenges and understood the problems that we were putting forward, and were supportive in trying to help us manage those. But the question, I guess, would be how much that was influencing ultimately the decisions that were being taken in the Cabinet Office and at Number 10.
And Mr. Hewitt, I'm not going to be asking you about what the Home Office went about doing after those concerns were raised, but I do want to ask about what the MPCC were doing towards the end of March, the beginning of April, having identified those concerns. What steps were the MPCC taking to address the hidden harms and to protect children from that risk you were so concerned about?
So we were working again very much through our coordinating committees that lead on child-related issues. So there was work going on among those groups to really identify not only the specific concerns that we were worried about, but then also to be monitoring. And as I say, the analytical groups that were pulling the information together very regularly so that we could understand how that situation was going forward. I was then sitting at the middle. We were engaging very clearly with all the individual forces. And as information came through, as we understood a phenomenon more, as the situation moved, as the various regulations and COVID restrictions changed, we would be feeding that out very regularly out to chief constables. On a daily basis, information would be going out into forces. And one of the other things that we set up at the very outset was a learning element within what we were doing. It was patently clear from the outset that we were going to end up in territory that we had never been in before in policing, certainly since the Second World War. And so it was really important for us that we were taking all of that learning through, and that was being fed out very quickly out to forces. And then the point, to repeat the point, those chief constable, chief officers that led around, be that around child and young persons strategies, around child abuse, whether child sexual exploitation, child sexual abuse, all of those groups work absolutely routinely with the various other organisations, public bodies, charities, support groups that operate in those spaces. So we were working very closely with them through our normal channels to try and to make sure that we could share information, to make sure that we could understand what was being understood by those other groups who necessarily will have different lines of communication and will be told things in a different way than policing are told. But it was about working together collectively to try and see what we needed to do in the way that we were operating to mitigate the impacts as best we could.
So, Mr. Hewitt, if we break that down, you've explained Operation Tala. People were bringing information into Tala. You've set out your concerns. Were you then saying to the chief constables or the individual forces, there is going to be a surge in domestic abuse, there's going to be a surge in child sexual offending, we need to take action and this is what we need to do?
Absolutely, that would be one of our focus, but it is really important to say that would have been coming up from the chief constables undoubtedly as well. There is and was no chief constable who would not be fundamentally concerned about, be it domestic abuse and the impact on children or child abuse in its various forms. That is day-to-day priority areas for them to focus on. So they would have all been aware of that in their own context. My role was to make sure that that was absolutely clear from the national operation, that we were bringing together all of the information, the understanding, the learning that we could, and then sharing that subsequently with them, that we were using the various coordinating committees and other groups that we had within MPCC already in existence, and then that I was feeding that through and very clearly into through the Home Office into government as part of the sort of broader understanding of the pandemic response.
Mr. Hewitt, I want now to turn, please, to actual harm to children during the pandemic. So we've set out the concerns. If we can have on screen, please, INQ 0006515552. this is your witness statement you provided to the inquiry, and we can see at paragraph 173 that the COVID-19 restrictions meant that those crimes that occurred in the home and online appeared to increase. So you had the concerns, you thought what was going to happen was in fact now happening. And if we can now first deal with domestic abuse, please. If we can have on screen INQ 000651887. This is a witness statement from the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the NSPCC, and we can see that at paragraph 75, their helpline saw a 53% increase in contacts from people with concerns about children experiencing physical abuse, and that was between March to July 2020. And if we can move on, please, to INQ 0006-20981. I think you referred to this already, haven't you, Mr. Hewitt, about a knowledge-sharing event.
Yes.
And we can see that this is the Operation Tala knowledge-sharing event that took place on the 4th of August 2020, a specific focus on children. And we know that individual police forces at this point were asked about their experiences as what was happening locally and the threats and the risks that were posed to children during the lockdown. So is that another good example of how the national coordination come together?
Yes.
And the information was found from the ground that was filtered into Operation Tala, and that knowledge was then shared across the country.
Yes, the process of knowledge-sharing events, which, as it happens, it now continues to this day within NPCC as a means of being able to share that. But I think the other really important point there is linking and working across the previous point that you made around NSPCC. That was a good example of how we were trying to manage a very unusual, if not unique, situation, because clearly other organisations would be in possession of information and understanding, and those helplines, whether it was in the child abuse world or in domestic abuse, we were constantly linked in to be able to understand what was coming through to us would be very different in reported crime, but also understanding what was going through to the various helplines for those organisations where people who were at concern would necessarily reach out to.
And if we can turn to page 3 of this document, we can see that there was an entry from Hampshire. And at the very bottom of the page, we can see that domestic abuse has seen an overall increase of 12%, which is also reflected in high-risk cases. The number of children involved in domestic abuse cases has risen by 14%, and social care are saying that they have an increase in demand of 15%. And at the very bottom, there has been a big reduction in the numbers of children as victims of crime. And you alluded to a moment ago, Mr. Hewitt, that the picture the police were seeing in terms of reported figures was very different compared to what the third sector were maybe coming to you with, because already from the NSPCC, we've seen quite significant increases in their reported calls and referrals relating to both child sexual offending and domestic violence. We can see from the last paragraph on screen that there was a big reduction in Hampshire. So this is an example in August 2020. Throughout policing figures and statistics during the pandemic, do we therefore have to apply some caution to maybe what was reported, because that may not actually show the true picture?
I would personally say that that's worth applying at all times, really, and particularly when I think we're talking about domestic abuse, sexual offending, child abuse. It is very well known, I think, that you will always have a degree of under-reporting. I think what this is reflecting here, of course, was the point that I alluded to earlier, is we were really concerned that this was likely to happen, because in many senses a lot of the environments in which a child may have the opportunity to disclose a concern or an allegation were being closed down by the fact that they weren't in contact with the sort of other adults that they would be in contact with, or the other environments where it might be spotted. So we were very alive to this, and I think what this document demonstrates is the fact that we were trying to approach this from as many angles as we could to have the clearest picture of what we thought was actually happening.
Mr. Hewitt, I'm sorry, maybe I've misunderstood that final sentence. I don't know if you or Mr. Lee can help me. If you have a number of children involved in domestic abuse cases rising and a number of children the subject of sexual abuse rising, then as victims of crime, the number should be rising. So I read that final sentence as the numbers of children as victims of crime outside the home, but maybe I've got that wrong. It says the numbers of children as
Yes.
victims of crime and as offenders.
Yes.
And so I read it as, I don't know.
But you may be, yeah, that may be correct. We certainly saw for outside of the house, there were certain crime types went down where you would often have children as the victim and often as the offender. Yeah. So we clearly saw that. But within, and I think the first paragraph there is really talking about the impact on the children who were by that stage clearly locked into the domestic scenario when you then get domestic abuse situations occurring, that whereas in other circumstances potentially that would be happening while the children were not present. So I think that's correct.
And Mr. Hewitt, we know that in the early stages of the pandemic, a particular concern for the National Crime Agency was around the ability to detect abuse in the family home. And in their view, they say it was likely to reduce. If we could have on screen, please, INQ 0006-48730. We can see that this is a document from the NSPCC. And on screen is a disclosure made by a 9-year-old boy about what life was like under lockdown between March 2020 and August 2020. And we can see that the disclosure makes, my mum and dad hit me and my younger brother today. Since lockdown, my mum and dad have been getting angry with each other and they end up hitting us. They've punched and hit us on the legs, arms and sometimes our faces. I've got some bruises and marks. It hardly ever happened before lockdown. Nobody else knows about it, and my parents have threatened that things will get worse if I tell anyone. I am finding it really hard after they hit us. There's lots of shouting. I run to my room or out into the garden to get away from it. During a global pandemic and in the context of people having to stay at home, did it become harder than ever to really understand what was going on and the increased risk that was potentially posed to children?
Definitely. I mean, certainly those things that were happening in the domestic environment, it was considerably harder, as I say, because you're not often in a preemptive opportunity to be into those environments. You are reliant, or we are reliant, policing is reliant on the child having an opportunity to report what has happened, or for some other adult to identify that they think there may have been those issues, which is exactly as the one that just described there. So this put it into a completely different place in terms of the ability for us to understand precisely what was going on.
Mr. Hewitt, we will return to reflections and lessons learned, but I think it's important at this point. Can you help us with what can be done in the event of a future pandemic, whereby a pandemic results in people having to spend a significant amount of time at home in the family environment?
I think the first thing would be, for whatever regulations and however things are planned, there didn't appear to me to be any consideration of the specific situation that children would find themselves in. And that comes into how we were having to police the regulations externally as well. So I think you've got that. It's then also having much clearer routes through which anyone in a lockdown situation has the ability to report crime. Not just children, but equally adults as well, because this was true again for the domestic abuse scenario. So particularly in households where there are already pre-existing concerns about potential child abuse scenarios and or domestic abuse scenarios, having mechanisms that are in place and can be explained to people as to how those that might be victims in those environments have a means of seeking help, I think would, and I don't underestimate how challenging that is. And for some domestic abuse scenarios, there are ways that can be done. But I'm not aware of that having been particularly considered around children.
But I think, Mr. Hewitt, is it your view that should be considered as
yeah, if we were ever again in that situation, and this is, we're talking specifically about those, if you like, crime issues in the household, but it just seems to me more generally in terms of the impact that was going to have on children and young people needs to be something factored in very clearly in the thought processes, both in the planning and then obviously in the implementation.
Mr. Hughes, if we can now turn to child sexual abuse, if we can have on screen INQ 000231058. This is a note from the COVID-19 Resilience and Preparedness meeting about the operational threat update on the 24th of March 2020. At the time, we know people were staying at home. And Simon Bailey, who you've already referred to, the police lead for child sexual abuse and exploitation, explained that there are early signs that there are more people viewing indecent imagery of children in the last 2 to 3 days than in the last 2 to 3 months. If we can move, please, to the next document, which is INQ 000651887. Paragraph 77 of the statement from the NSPCC again highlights that they saw a threefold increase in the number of childline counselling sessions about child sexual abuse within the family, from an average of 8 sessions per week before the pandemic restrictions were imposed to an average of 23 per week from March to May 2020. And finally, we know that the National Crime Agency disseminated more intelligence referrals relating to online child sexual abuse to police forces during the pandemic than they did in 2019. Again, Mr. Hewitt, I think you've already outlined in your evidence what the key factors were and what the key drivers were in your view as to why this type of offending would increase. Given you were worried about it, given we know that there was a surge, does that question the effectiveness of the mitigations put in by the police to try and limit harm to children?
The reality, I think, from the outset was that we were only ever going to be able to put in some mitigations that were not going to be able to be comprehensive because of the situation that we were in and the situation that individual households were in. I mean, the quote there about the number of individuals in households that were then, viewing the images online. I mean, that was that. I'm not sure how we could have controlled that from the exterior in the way that we would obviously have wanted to, and so many of our routes for being able to directly intervene in either the offending behaviour or in the vulnerability of the children were restricted by the fact that the lockdown operated in the way that it did.
Mr. Hewitt, again, the same question in relation to domestic abuse. If we were to enter another lockdown, people were locked at home, people having more access to computers and the internet, is there anything that the government could do or policing could do in the future to try and get on top of this before it gets out of hand? I think,
as I said before, it's about really considering that in a deep way as you are working through, or as a government is working through, what are the restrictions that we need to put in place here. In both of those cohorts, you will start at any given point in time. You will start with a cohort of particularly vulnerable people, either particularly vulnerable people or, quite frankly, people who are more likely offending in those areas. So for me, there is something about being able to plan through what are those additional safety nets and mitigations that you can put in place for both the vulnerable group and the more likely offending group in advance. And as I say, some of those things were available around particularly domestic abuse, where there were already schemes in place to allow because domestic abuse victims can often be within the household and it's dangerous for them to call police and so on. So I think thinking through all of those mechanisms, and we are now in a different technological space than we were back in 2020 as well. So I think it's about really looking and thinking, what are those capabilities that can be there for someone who is potentially vulnerable, and also for how we can monitor those who are potentially more dangerous.
Mr. Hewitt, I now want to move on to a new topic, and that is policing children. The COVID-19 regulations and children playing outside.
Yeah.
You refer to the term again in your statement as public health policing. Was it right, just to set the context, that the police were responsible to enforce COVID-19 regulations, which included, and I'll stick to just some of the central and the key regulations, the general public to remain at home unless they had a reasonable excuse, such as shopping, work or exercise, and also to enforce a requirement for people not to gather in public in groups of 3 or more, unless this was for work or if they're in the same household. And again, the inquiry appreciates that the regulations were constantly changing.
They were.
But are they really the central ones that the police were having to go out on the street to enforce?
Yes, I mean those were and particularly the remaining at home was in the first instance was the primary one that caused, I think, the most significant challenges for policing.
And it's right, isn't it, that the regulations apply to children in the same way as the regulations apply to adults? There
was no differentiation between children and adults in the regulations, which was very challenging from an operational policing perspective.
Mr. Hewitt, if we can have on screen, please, INQ 005888036. We can see at paragraph 66B, and just to explain what this document is, Mr. Hewitt, it's a witness statement from Miss Alice Ferguson, the founder and director of Playing Out. The inquiry has also heard live evidence from Miss Ferguson, and in her statement she sets out why, in her opinion, the UK government decisions did not consider or support children's need for free play, outdoor time, social contacts and physical activity. And we can see she sets out at 66B, no clarity about outdoor play for children in the rules or official messaging, no clear advice to the public, local authorities or to the police, resulting in confusion, vastly different interpretations and responses, and ultimately many children being prevented or discouraged from playing outside. Would you agree with that analysis?
I would agree very strongly with that analysis, and the reality. It was police officers on the ground in all of the forces that were having to undertake the policing of the health restriction policing. And as I know the inquiry is familiar, we came out with a way of doing that, which was about engaging people, encouraging them to follow the rules, engaging people, explaining the rules, encouraging them to follow, and then only at the end enforcing. That was even harder. You were then relying on individual police officers to take discretion in the people that they met. You alluded to the rules. It was very indistinct about what was a legitimate reason to be outside or not. But the other really important point for me is the pandemic was not experienced in the same way by everybody, and particularly the lockdown situation. If you lived in a 3-bedroom house with your own garden, the concept of being locked indoors and having to teach your children, or for your children to be on Zoom calls with their school, was one experience. If you were with 3 children in a 2-bedroom flat on the 9th floor of a high-rise block with no outdoor space, your experience of COVID was considerably different. There are social inequalities in everything, but I think the experience of the pandemic, and particularly the lockdown, really highlighted those. And so it became very difficult for our officers, where someone in that latter circumstance just wants to allow those children to get out into some fresh air in a kind of open space near where they were, but that was breaching the regulations. And you were then in the situation for the officers to have to deal with those circumstances, which was very, very challenging for them.
And Mr. Hewitt, you explain in your statement that as the pandemic progressed, that there was a growing recognition of the importance of play for children's mental health and development. Police forces were advised to use discretion and common sense when encountering children playing, and you say this helped to maintain public trust and avoided unnecessary. Can I take it as read then from what you've told the inquiry this afternoon, that it was your view that you needed, and officers on the ground needed, clearer guidance as to what children could be outside for and what they couldn't be outside for?
I think throughout, and with children definitely, but more broadly, the clarity of what was permissible, what was not permissible, where the regulations changed was a constant theme throughout the pandemic, and increasingly as regulations changed. Just having the time and then coming with very clear parameters, because it then becomes quite unfair, because you are more and more relying on the individual discretion of the individual police officer, and we were having to go through the process of trying to explain to all of those individual police officers across the UK what we thought was the best way for them to interpret the regulations and enforce them.
And in terms of the type of notice that these officers were getting, so the officers that are going out on the ground, children are playing, they've then got to enact what the regulations say. How long were these officers getting to read the regulations, to understand them?
So we produced, every time there was a regulation changed, we went through a process of producing briefings to go out to forces. The reality is, the worst occasion was when the regulation changed, and it was 16 minutes before that became a regulation in law. And so clearly on that example, I refused for us to start enforcing that in 16 minutes later because it wasn't possible. We had to go through a process legally to understand the regulation, then to produce some briefings that we could then share out to all the officers to give them, as best we could, our understanding of the right way, using discretion for them to actually manage those regulations. So we would then distribute those, and then once I was satisfied that those had gone out to all forces, we would then start to actually police that particular regulation. But of course, for individual officers, we are talking about officers who are, generally speaking, it would be response and patrol officers that would be interacting in this way. They would be on 24-hour shifts, so we would have processes to try and make sure that they were getting their briefings. And on occasion, these regulations changed quite quickly. And the other thing that we do have to bear in mind is, for police officers, the regulations for most of the pandemic were different in the 4 countries of the United Kingdom. And so in some senses, not so much. But if you were working in a border area, that became quite a challenge for police officers as well, where the regulations could literally be different on one side of the road to the other. And then, of course, as we moved through and you started to get the more localised lockdowns, that again created some real challenges for police officers in making sure that they were interpreting the regulation appropriately for the place they were in, and then obviously having to deal with the members of the public who would be probably quite confused themselves as well.
Well, Mr. Hewitt, we know that in terms of enforcement, a fixed penalty notice couldn't be issued to a child.
Yes.
But would you accept that, given the way the regulations were enforced or encouraged, that it had the practical effect of children being sent home from playing at the playground, building snowmen?
It definitely did.
And again, the inquiry heard evidence from Miss Ferguson, and to summarise what she said, she provided an example about the impact on children having been stopped playing out by the police, and she said it was huge. She referred to what she called the snowman story. There were 2 brothers who lived in a high-rise flat in central London. They had no garden, no access to outside space. They came out when it snowed and built a snowman together, and this was in January 2021. The police arrived, told them off. They were told to go back inside because they were breaking the law. She then said she spoke to their dad recently, and he explained what the impact was on the children. He said one of his sons in particular hadn't fully recovered. He was still socially anxious. He'd lost his confidence about going out and being social. That's an example from 2021. You've already explained that it was difficult for officers on the ground to interpret the regulations. At any point, were you going to the Home Secretary and saying, we need more guidance, this is what's happening on the ground, you need to help?
We were making the point around children very clearly, and that example is a good and sort of sad example of the situation there. Because again, from my perspective, I said at the very beginning, one of my priorities was that policing the pandemic was not going to manifestly impact on the public relationship with policing, and examples like that are exactly the kind of example that I was concerned about, and we did. I was repeatedly raising the issue that this was causing difficulty, and then where it manifested itself later on was in the phenomenon of the unlicensed music events that started when things opened up a little bit further, and of course a lot of the people that were trying to go to those unlicensed music events were teenagers, because it was a chance for them to get out and be sociable and do all of the things that they would want to do. And that again put the police very much in a kind of conflict situation with groups of young people who felt that what they were doing was not unreasonable.
There'll be a number of references to the Home Office, but of course one of the problems you faced, as I recall from our discussion about this before, was that the regulations were coming from the DHSC.
Correct.
And the Home Office had limited input.
I tried to sort of make that point in answer to the earlier question, but that was right. I genuinely believe that the Home Office officials and ministers that we were engaged with absolutely understood the challenge that was being presented. And the Home Secretary and Police Minister at the time were absolutely focused on, we cannot let all of this fundamentally damage the relationship between police and police in general, public in general, particularly with particular communities. And I would argue young people are a really key community where it is always challenging the relationship between policing and young people. So they absolutely got that. I think the challenge was how much influence that was having when it got to the key decision making being done at the centre.
Mr. Hughes, I'm going to move on to my final topic, and it's one question. If we can have on screen, please, INQ 000649420. We can see that this is a report, Policing the Pandemic. It was a report commissioned by Policing. It focused on exploring young people's experiences and recommendations. The report's dated in July 2020, and it provides a snapshot of young people's views and experiences of policing during lockdown between May and June 2020, and the project gathered views of over 3,900 young people across England and Wales. The report made 11 key recommendations, the general theme being how the police can improve their communication and engagement with children and young people. How did these recommendations, which are on page 13, feed into future work of the NPCC or the work of other police forces?
Yeah, so they, absolutely did, and obviously work through our children and young persons portfolio, which is chaired by, as I say, it was a deputy chief constable, now chaired by a chief constable, and so that was absolutely key. We already had a child centres policing best practice framework, which actually had been published in January of 2020, and at that stage quite clearly had not in any sense envisaged a pandemic. So working through with the recommendations from that group and others, because we also worked with the National Youth. There was a National Youth Agency report called Out of Sight, which we supported again, which was looking at the impact that this had all had on children. So that feeds through. We are currently, the updated version of the report that I just referred to is the Child and Young Persons Policing Strategy, which the latest version came out last year and takes us through till 2027. And we've also now got, purely coincidentally, I think, either today or if it hasn't been this week, a Children and Young Persons Charter for 2025, which again picks up on the core issue which sits here, which is about that absolutely critical relationship between policing and young people. And the fact of the matter is that what we had to do with policing the pandemic, and whilst accepting all of the health security issues and the requirements for that, and I entirely understand those, what really concerned us at the outset and throughout was the impact this was having on the relationship between young people and policing, and the potential sort of enduring issue that would have.
Thank you, Mr. Hewitt. My lady, those are my questions. Do you have any questions?
I don't. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hewitt. I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that's the end of the demands we're going to make on your time. I appreciate you've been asked questions about matters at a high level for obvious reasons, but please reassure any of your former colleagues that Module 10 will be examining the impact on a number of key workers, and I was recently looking at the Roundtable report, and that includes a number of police officers who were on the ground trying to enforce these rather confusing regulations.
I think that'll be appreciated. It is easy to underestimate the challenge that put in, and the fact that, as I said earlier, whilst they were working there and doing what they were doing professionally, they were all still impacted in the same way as all of us by the concerns that the pandemic had for yourself and your family. So I think that will be much appreciated.
Good. Well, thank you again for all the help you've given.
No, thank you.
Very grateful. Very well. I shall return at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
All rise.